Today, I'm really excited to have Aayush Mudgal on the podcast. Ayush is currently a senior machine learning engineer at Pinterest, where he is working on the ML for ads rankings, as well as being the tech lead for privacy aware conversion modeling. Ayush started his career as a researcher in ML and AI before moving to Netflix and working on their computer vision systems. After Netflix, he went to go do more research before coming to Pinterest. Outside of these positions, Ayush is also a startup mentor and a seed investor, particularly in ad and edtech startups. It was really great to have Ayush on the podcast because social media has dominated the tech sector for the last 10 years, and particularly those algorithms that power the social media platforms are very interesting because those are really what the bread and butter are. And to talk to someone that is in the system and has built algorithms that millions of people have used every single day and is spearheading the new changes that social media platforms have to adapt to because of laws and just in general more platform changes. It was really, really interesting, and I think it was a very insightful conversation. So, with that said, I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Hey, Ayush, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, no, super excited to have you on and talk to you about your experiences at both Pinterest and Netflix. But before we get into all of that great stuff, let's start from the beginning. What brought you into the world of technology and specifically machine learning?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think I have some story to share there in general. Like, I went to India. I was born and brought up in India in general, and I went to IIT Kanpur for my undergraduate studies. I joined in 2012. Around that time, I think, as a typical Indian, I think there are only two options, like engineering or do you want to do medical sciences? And I chose engineering because I was good in mathematics and bad in biology. So that's
Right.
how I ended up being at IIT Kanpur, and I got into computer science. So I was like in computer science, and computers did fascinate me. I was not sure about other branches of engineering, so I ended up at Kanpur. But in 2012, I think machine learning was not that active in general. So when I joined, I don't think it was as prominent in India, at least, as what it is here today in general. So I think my first year was just like normal computer science. In my second year, I think I got an opportunity to work on like program synthesis and tutoring system, which was a very cool idea in general. The idea was around can you automate the process of teaching programming to students by giving them hints on the lines of what they are thinking. So that was a good problem where we collaborated with Microsoft Research in Redmond, but even around that time, I think the tools that we were doing were pretty different than how the field has changed with new LLMs in general. So if I look back from 2015, 14, I think things have drastically changed in machine learning and how things are being approached. And we were doing a very different methodology around that time. And then I was lucky to intern at Carnegie Mellon on a similar domain, similar theme. But when I was at Carnegie, I could see like machine learning. Like I had a big eye opener,
Mm-hmm.
and I was also lucky, like IIT Kanpur being one of the top institutes in India, we did have faculty experienced in machine learning coming in around that time, and that gave me a good background to pick up. So that's where I picked it up. But then when I was graduating, I was like, do I want what field do I want to do in? Like these are two different fields, but today those two fields might have converged together in some sense. But then I decided to do a master's to figure out what I want to do. So I ended up landing up at Columbia, and at Columbia I think Columbia had a strong faculty in NLP in general, like natural language, and I
Right.
got to work on different aspects of summarization. But things that we were doing in NLP in 2017 is totally different than what's happening today. So I think field has advanced. But yeah, I think I worked on NLP. I got to work at Netflix during that time on computer vision, and I was doing a bit of object detection. So those were like different areas. But when I graduated from there, I had made up my mind that I think industry is where I wanted to be, not
Right.
necessarily being in academia or doing some research. And then I went to Pinterest. Pinterest was a good sweet spot. Like it was not too big, not too small. I knew that it's going to IPO, so there was a big bit of cushion. It was still pre-IPO in that perspective, but I knew it's
Yeah.
going to about to get IPO, and that's how I joined Pinterest. Totally different than what I was doing in recommendation systems, specifically ads. Like around that time, there was a big push for Pinterest to do the ads business, and that's where all the hiring was happening, and that's how I ended up being in ads. and I loved it so far. I've been there, same team over 6 years, so like, and I've been at the same team, so I loved what I've been doing, and
Mhm.
yeah, that's what I think bit of my background in general. But yeah,
No, for sure, that makes sense, and definitely a lot to unpack there. I think, for people who don't know, IIT is one of the best. They have a bunch of branches in India, but there's some of the best engineering talent in the world. And they've already made such a big impact in Silicon Valley, and they continue to do that. So definitely, your story of going into IIT and eventually coming to the Bay Area is something I think a lot of IIT graduates share. And I think it's been really interesting to see how much, even in the last 5-10 years, not only how much talent is coming to the Bay Area, but how much talent's also building companies in India now as well that are
yeah,
competing on a global scale. So definitely, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's funny you mentioned about machine learning and AI, and I think when I first came to the University of Waterloo in 2016, of course it was still relatively big then. People were talking about it, and I was, even at that time, I was like very excited, pretty bullish on it. I thought that it was definitely going to make a very interesting field to get into, and it'll make a big impact. But nowadays, it's gone on a completely different level. It's on a hype train now. So it's been really interesting to see how much it's grown, and the exponential growth in the last year.
yeah,
And I'm excited to see where it goes in the future as well.
yeah. I think yeah. Thanks for like the pitch for IIT. Thanks for that. But yeah, I think even when I was at Netflix, right, like people were reading about like attention is all you need in 2018, but they never knew that this is like how it will end up in like 5 years down the line, like changing everything in general. And that's amazing. And I think the hard work was being done for a long time. I think it's connecting to product now in general, that you can see some of its implications widely, and
Mhm.
that's a cool thing in general.
Totally, yeah, and I'm sure, like, you mentioned you've done a couple research positions in the past before you got into industry, but I'm sure there were a lot of concepts and principles in your research that you might have seen, like especially a couple years ago with LLMs and just generative AI, but you may have not seen like, oh wow, this this can actually be productized like it has been, right? And I think
Yeah,
that's what's been really interesting, is that a lot of these advancements aren't necessarily new ones, but they're new in the product realm of things, which makes it
yeah,
really exciting.
yeah, totally.
But yeah, going into, so you mentioned, okay, you joined Pinterest pre-IPO, of course, that's a good time to join. But in general, I think in Silicon Valley, especially, you have so many different options, so many different companies to work at, small startups, big startups, big companies. So, like in general, what has been your thought process or the logic you've used to decide on what to pursue next, and what have you let guide yourself into making those decisions?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think one thing that always like, what do I want to learn next in general, right? Like when I was joining outside, like outside, like academia in general, like I didn't have any industry experience and exposure of that magnitude in general. So I wanted to be at a place where I could learn from people which had like a good enough tech stack, because personally I was not like a building the software behind it in general. I was not that kind of a person around that time. So I wanted like something that has a good tech stack in general,
Right.
not too complicated. Like I know like Google and Facebook have probably solved all the problems. So someone which is still trying to find and solve some problems, I think that's where I think the sweet spot for me was at Pinterest. And then I can learn from other people in general. So that was something like going for a very small company, at least around that time, was this factor. Like I myself am not confident in delivering everything end to end. So maybe like something where I can learn from others was something that I wanted to do. Not
Right.
necessarily I want to be at that same situation. Like it might change over time, but like that's what promoted me to go at Pinterest. And then around that time, I think I had like I was considering between Pinterest and Rubrik. Like Rubrik was also about to IPO. It hasn't IPO'd yet, but I think it's about to IPO. But yeah, I think the thing that played for me was like I wanted to do machine learning, and I think that's where I decided, okay, at Pinterest I could see myself doing machine learning, which I was not sure about at Rubrik, even though they have a good products. I think what you want to do next in terms of technology, and then I think that's the thing that probably also motivates. And then I was lucky to have a senior at Pinterest in the same team who I trusted. So since he was working, I could just, okay, if he is there, I can also join the company. It makes sense. And yeah, I think having the network of people and then trust there in general, I think. that promoted me to like join Pinterest in some sense.
Totally. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think, yeah, optimizing for, of course, working with smart people that you know and trust is one thing, and then finding different companies where you can contribute, make a difference, whether it be in their tech stack or whether it be into the problem that they're solving, is definitely really interesting. And I think that makes a lot of sense. But let's get into it then. Let's talk about your experience building at Pinterest. Like you mentioned, you've been there for a while now, and I found it really interesting that in an article around 8 years ago, the Atlantic stated that Pinterest is going to be one of the four ways that people find things on the internet. And basically, adding on to that, what they mentioned is like Google is sort of your default. You search for things, you find it. And for real time searches, you have Twitter where things are trending and you get to figure out what's happening in the world today. And then for people or entities and companies, you have Facebook, and now I think it's sort of divulged also into Instagram a little bit. But when it comes to finding things and objects, they said that Pinterest is going to be, or is the way to go, to find things and objects on the internet. And so, of course, that was 8 years ago. Pinterest has evolved a lot over the years. But when you look at Pinterest today, do you think that still stays true, or do you think it's changed now?
So I think it still stays true in general. Like Pinterest is still the visual discovery engine. I think that's the aspect I think that Pinterest has unique to it is that one is like it's a user, like most of the content is like created by the users themselves in general. So what they like. So there's some bit of like quality in there in general. Like okay, this is the user and this is the popularity of these content. So that's like one important thing. But also it's like how I want to pitch it is also like when you go to Google, you know exactly what you're trying to search in words, but sometimes you cannot represent things in words in general. You have some idea, but you cannot represent them, not express them in words that easily. I think that's where Pinterest comes in, being more of like a visual discovery engine. So if you have some images, you get to start, and then you can move around the web of images in general, and you can discover. So it's mostly on that discovering phase. The other positive part I see is that I think there was a study in 2018 around like by TalkShop that mentioned about like 95, 91% of pinners feel positive about Pinterest and their use case. So that's like one thing that I feel very positive is that when I spend time on Pinterest, I don't feel that I'm wasting time or something like that. Like it's like you have a very personal space in general. Like you are in that space. You don't need to worry about like getting more likes or getting more like comments or something like that. So I think that's unique to Pinterest, and I think that's something I'm happy about in general. And I think recently, I think Pinterest also partnered with like Half Story, a nonprofit in general, where they're trying to promote like having purpose in general, trying to cater the content, promoting like digital well-being in general, like making sure. I think one of the mission of Pinterest is also to ensure that you give people inspiration to do something in their lives. So it's not about being on the platform, but also like learning from the platform, going around and trying to do things. Maybe it's painting or like something else, like planning for your travels. I think that's like a motivation that's positive in some sense.
Right, right. That makes a lot of sense. And I think, one of the areas you touched on there is, the recommendation of content, right? And I think with all social media, that's sort of the huge differentiating factor, where, we're getting to a point where before users used to search for exactly what they want. But at this point, users expect that they just go on the homepage and they basically see that unless they're looking for something very, very specific. And especially we've seen in the last couple of years something like TikTok has grown rapidly because of their approach with their algorithm and how much it's able to capture people's different personalities and what they want. So I, of course, Pinterest is also industry leading as well. So as someone with exposure to building that algorithm, like how do you think about this problem about finding the right recommendation for your users?
Yeah, I think personalization is like very crucial in that respect. And I think because you have a big corpus of content that you can show, but then not all users are interested in that content. So you need to connect content and users in a seamless way. And that's where I think the entire machine learning or this complex algorithms go into picture to figuring out what the user's diverse interests are. And the other part is those interests can change over time. Like it's not that a user, but your understanding of the user is temporal. It can keep changing. and it's important for platform to understand like how is it changing over time and how it impacts the user. So sometimes you might be in a short journey, you're just interested in, let's say, finding something to paint, but maybe next month you don't want to do that. So how do you like do it in a more real-time manner, capture these understanding from the users, and then there are like ton of like machine learning algorithms that go behind it. I can go into more details, but also it's important to understand like once you develop this system, it's important to understand like how do you measure it in general, like is it helping your users or not, like how do you develop those metrics in general, like how do you measure like user satisfaction, which can be both short term and long term, and it's an entire complex thing in itself. Like it could be just clicks, but then clicks could not be a total factor. It could be something like how often do people save, how often people hide. So I think it's more about that, and then you also need to give users ability to give the model to unlearn itself. Something like, let's say if you are looking for like if you're looking for like your wedding clothes or something like that, but when wedding happens you don't want that content to keep coming again and again because the event has gone. So you need
Right.
a way where people can interpret and like intervene and change your understanding of the system. And then I think Pinterest, like one thing that I feel was is good about Pinterest, like Pinterest is like multimodal in general. Like it has images are backed by text content. And one of the things is how you set up this personalization, right? Like what kind of features you can collect from the users. Like for TikTok, right? Like when you have TikTok, you're only seeing one video in general, so it's easy for TikTok to collect signals of user interaction. But if you go to Google, like Google has maybe bunch of text, like if you search, there are bunch of query, like bunch of results that are there. Then how do you know which one is the user clicking or seeing? So having the right surface to collect this feedback is important. And at Pinterest, I think we have multiple surfaces collecting different kind of feedbacks, and that helps you to generate this kind of personalization system, which is crucial to connect people in general.
Right, right. I think one interesting, actually one interesting point you mentioned there is like, yeah, like somebody could be planning for a wedding, right? Where they, for 6 months they just focus on finding wedding content, but then of course after they get married, it's a whole different suite of content they're looking for. They're not really as interested in the wedding stuff. So that's a really interesting problem, I think, in terms of recommendations, like finding timed events and knowing when to switch your content. So what do you think about it from developing, your ML systems? What are some ways you think you'd tackle that problem?
Yeah, I think there's some of the ways that the industry is doing is like you maintain a very like a short-term memory of the user. So it's about like whatever you're interacting maybe today or a day before. So that's one memory. And then you also maintain a long-term memory which goes beyond like maybe 2 months, 3 months of what they have interacted in general. So now it's a combination of these two in general. So if you see that, and you can compare diversity across your whatever content you're showing and how the person is reacting. Like if you're showing the same things but like the person is not reacting positively, you can start to demote those content in general through your algorithm. So having both like a short term long term kind of memory, and then also not only optimizing for current rewards in general, like not just optimizing for like point rewards like just clicks, but maybe also looking into like how often does the user come back to the app or not in general, how often are they active in general. So I think those are the things you can also optimize in general to make it more diverse. And also at times you need to keep it diverse in general. It's not about you show like if you're looking for let's say Nike shoes and that's your interest, you don't want to bombard with everything Nike shoes, and that's also like you need to have some kind of diversity in
Right.
general about like the content that you're showing in general.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And I think, one thing that's also really interesting, and you sort of touched on there, is how diverse content is getting, right? And I think we're reaching a point where seemingly each niche has a decent sized audience. I think, it's really interesting, whether it's in social media and just general content, or it's in something like a startup, like like what I'm doing. There's so many different problem spaces that have billion-dollar markets that people don't even think about, because there's just this seems to be an audience that's growing in a bunch of different spaces. So you know you have a bunch of content which is pretty diverse, and you have a niche with a decent sized audience, and then you also have a range of diversity of advertisers as well, right? Which have some more niche products and they want to advertise it to them. So when you think about classifications of users into categories, essentially, in order to serve those ads to your users, and serving specialized ad recommendations, I think the problem can get very interesting, because you can keep going down and down the rabbit hole, but at the same time you want to make sure your ads are still general enough that they're able to reach a general audience or a bigger audience. So how do you keep those categories for classification general while still serving ads with the highest overlap?
Yeah, I think that's a great problem in general, and I think that's a very relevant problem that I think ads companies in general face. So I think in general, I think ads is still easier, I would say, than organic content to understand this diversity, because for an ads recommendation, advertisers can still be given these levers that they want to target in general. So you can have, okay, advertisers know what their target audiences are. So you can have these levers that they can use, and some of them can be very simple, like age, location in general. But then these are like very restrictive in general. You cannot like target to the right audience. Then I think there's this concept of interest in general, like depending on, like we have like annotations on pins in general, like what kind of content a pin is, and then when the users interacts with those pins, we get an understanding of the user behavior, about what the user behaviors are. And this is something like interest, and you can have like 20,000, 30,000 interests that you can compute for the content that's on Pinterest. With this, you can now provide this interest also to the advertisers to share, okay, these are what we have categorized the users, and they can select what works best for them. But
Right.
then there's another concept, what is like called as act alike targeting, or like act alike. If let's say advertisers knows, okay, these are five different people that have interacted with my product, I want to find users who are similar to these users in general for targeting. So that's where like machine learning also comes into play to identify users based on their activity or other demographics, like who are more common to a user that the advertiser knows. So then they can probably expand their reach to these users. Then you can
Mhm.
also do like kind of like in keywords kind of structures, like something like it, like you probably don't want to show like car ads everywhere, but if you're searching for car, you want car, so you can do like keywords there. And I think that's where I think the machine learning also comes into place. Like you don't want the advertisers to input all the keywords, so you need to suggest what different keywords it could be. Like car could also be mapped to synonyms like vehicles or something else. So then how do you have like an expanded list of words that can target to a similar audience in general? And I
Right.
think those are like some of the ways which I think levers which advertisers have and the platform can provide. So as we start, I think it's easier to build the easier products in general, like age, location, and those things. But as the product grows, like your offerings can kind of increases. And then the other offerings that companies have is like what happens if you choose this filter, like what's your reach, like how many users are you able to get to, what's the kind of performance you can predict. So those kind of planning work that happens around, like what's your estimate, like if you choose this kind of like diversity, like this kind of like distribution, like how many users can you reach. And then that's like kind of what can help them to decide like whether this works for their perspective of delivering or not in general.
Right. Right. That makes sense. But I think one of the interesting aspects you mentioned there is that you can have 20 to 30,000 interests, right? That your user has, or that the advertiser has, and I think what can be interesting there is, like, for example, in the startup world, right? You can have startups, you can have B2C startups, you can have consumer startups, and you can just keep going down and down the rabbit hole, right? You can go like software startups, and hard tech and deep tech startups, and there's like this, you can just keep going down the category. And I think what's interesting there, and this might be, I guess, more of a UI, or like a product issue more than an engineering issue, is like keep that how do you keep that deep classification so your algorithms can train off of that, but at the same time offer simplicity to both the user and especially the advertisers who are advertising on your platform, where if they are something like Brex, for example, that makes credit card for startups, they can just say, okay, I want the startup category, rather than I want having to list all these different interests or the specific ones. That's a really interesting problem that way.
Yeah, I think one way I think that could happen is like, what Brex is, you input your description, then you auto suggest like these are the interests that might fall into your category, and then maybe you can exclude stuff in general, like. this one doesn't make sense, but like how deep do you want to go into? I think having that UX, as you said, I think that's critical because the interest could be large. You need to make sure that you know the choices you're making in general while deciding the interest, and I think that's yeah, I think it's a fundamental problem that in
Hmm.
general.
Totally, yeah. And I think, like you mentioned there, NLP will be even more
Yeah,
essential, right? Like, yeah, you could even go so far to say, okay, tell me about your company, tell me sort of what demographic, and then like you put that through your model actually determines where that looks like in the interest. It classifies
yeah,
the input there using NLP and machine learning, and then it's able to, of course, put it through the recommendation systems as well. So super interesting. I think there's a lot of big changes also coming into the advertising space, and we can sort of touch on this a little bit later. But
yeah,
it's quite an interesting space for sure.
yeah,
And I think in general, if we look at any social media, the paid ads and the journey that users take on the platform is the bread and butter of social media apps. But we're reaching a point where the customer journey is being more difficult. It's a more difficult path to measure with disjointed devices or restrictions on the browser level in terms of tracking customers now with cookies and other levers there. So there's this new concept of this privacy aware conversion modeling that comes into play. And so I was just wondering, given your experience, because it seems like you have some work with that in Pinterest, how do you think about using ML to fill those gaps of the customer journey and path?
yeah. Yeah, I think that's yeah. I think the entire art industry has been like changing in that respect. I think that's probably going for maybe more than 2 years or like 1.5 to 2 years, and there are some changes that are being brought in by regulators and like companies alike in general for it to happen. But one thing that we need to remember is also like ads industry sustain a lot of businesses, like not only social medias, but it connects businesses with users, bringing them the right products in general. And without having like insight of that, I think it's like the entire industry is dependent in some way in general to bring this connection. So I think the good thing that's happening is like people are realizing that the data is important, and I think the thing that's happening is the users have more freedom to choose how they want to share the data. So that awareness is happening. Like you can choose how you want your data to be shared with whom in general, and that's a good power that's happening in the industry. And where ML is going to like help is like ML can help us in like more generalization capabilities in general, because it's not about knowing or memorizing a user in general, but it's about learning the patterns in the data without actually knowing who that pattern is coming from. It's like more on the aggregated level. It's not about measuring the data. And if you go back, like I think they were like there has been research in like privacy safe techniques like differential privacy, which was like which has been used by like US sensors like in healthcare domain for a very long time to share data among different parties in general. So those techniques which were being researched in general were not being used in the arts industry, but now with the changes I think it's becoming more responsible. Like you use like differential privacy and like those kind of techniques would become more prominent. And how do you do machine learning on encrypted data so that data is encrypted? You don't know, but can you extract patterns? Because it's all about extracting those patterns, not necessarily remembering who the user is and identifying some users. So I think that's where I think the industry is moving, also more towards like secure computations between different parties like advertisers and the media providers. I think that's I think having regulations, more restrictions, I think that's going to grow both like ads industry with privacy at heart. So I think that's a good change in that respect. And also I would say like these research have been going for a long time, and I think it's just that these are now getting applied to ads products, which is I think a good time in that perspective. And then like federated learning where you're like computing everything on the device, not like I think that's being used like by keyboards already in general, but now like those moving into the apps domain. I think some products might change in the way they are working, but then eventually I think everything is happening for a good reason.
That makes sense. Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of it's gonna be a lot of big changes, right? We've already seen a lot in the last couple of years, but I think we're only at the precipice of that. So it's gonna be interesting to see how it changes as we go. And in general, right? Like I think privacy is becoming more of a sticking point for platforms, right? Where it's something they have to really consider when they're building out their new recommendation systems or just in general throughout the platform. So when you think about recommendation systems from where they are where they were, where they are today, and to where they're becoming a little bit more privacy centric. How do you think they're going to evolve? Like, what do you think the big differences that you see are going to be?
So I think one thing is like recommendation systems will evolve to focus more on generalization in some sense and less on memorizing a particular user, which is like trying to, and this will also help in like in being more fair, reducing biases in your data set. So it's like from both directions, it's going to help in generalization capabilities in general. And one thing is we need to think about privacy as something that's integral part of in general. And new solutions should evolve that respect user privacy the way they want it to be. And at the same time, I think they still need to connect people and businesses in a meaningful way. So now there are techniques like instead of looking at individualization of the data, you look at more aggregated, generate those patterns. I think those are the techniques like that are going to evolve in general. Like how do you learn on aggregated fashion? And industry has been working on those problems for some time, so it's not like it's unsolvable problem. It's about how do you connect those things together and make it work in general. And also you need to focus more on what the user is sharing with you and what
Right.
they're doing on your platform in general to learn those patterns in general, not relying on things that are being shared across apps. So I think that sharing is going to probably get reduced, but sharing in more in an aggregated manner, not in a direct manner. So I think some part of the business would change, but I think that would be like make it more stronger in general.
Right. Right. That makes sense. Well, not talking about some of your other experiences. You also worked at Pinterest, of course, but you've also worked on Netflix in the past. And one of the things that's all really interesting there is that you were part of the computer vision team that was automating quality checks. But it's really interesting because Netflix has so much different content, and I just I wanted to figure out like what kind of quality checks were you looking for, and how did that help Netflix?
Yeah, I think I would say like I think Netflix, my manager at Netflix, he was quite a visionary guy in general. Like when I was signing up, I was not sure like what's the use of this in general, right? Like when I ended up Netflix, I think the task was this, right? Netflix also owns a studio in general. So the task that they wanted to solve was like when you shoot a movie, you have a lot of equipment, lot of like cameras, microphones that are on the scene when you shoot, and you might capture them. But when you're editing, you need to remove all of these equipment, and sometimes in some videos you might forget to remove them, or they're just there, and then people find it later. So the task there was like, can you identify like microphones, speakers in a scene, and then just automatically tag them so that okay, these scenes need to be removed or edited out. So that's like the process where like machine learning was helping them to speed up their post editing in general so that they know and have those quality checks. And apart from that, I think there are a lot of these things that were happening in the team, like subtitle placements. Like you don't want to place a subtitle on the face of a person, so that like you want to probably place it at a different place in the screen. So those were the things I think that were pretty like visionary. I imagine that in general that they would be doing if just looking at the product. But yeah, I think things as simple as that. I think there's a bit of machine learning going behind them in general to bring those experiences to people.
Right. No, that makes sense. And I have yeah, I have some friends who make films. So if this I'm sure it's internal facing right now, but if it ever becomes public, they'd be very happy to use that. And I think in general it's very interesting seeing how many new technologies that are coming out for film and just throw entertainment. But one of the ones that was very interesting to me was and all these new dubbing companies that have come out.
Yeah,
And I think I forget the name of the company, but there's a company that basically allows you to translate any of your films into different languages. So, if you want, the speaker can speak in English, of course, like if it's filmed in English, but then from there it can be like Spanish, Hindi,
yeah,
German, whatever. So there's some really interesting stuff coming in the entertainment industry, and I think some of it will be stuff we can see more transparently, like the languages. Some of them will be more hidden, like
yeah,
editors being able to edit out microphones and Starbucks cups and stuff like that outside of the scenes. So
yeah.
it'll be really interesting to see. And yeah, I know I gotta ask you this question because it's a hot topic right now, but of course, machine learning and AI are very broad, but you right now always just wants to talk about generative AI and any of the implications that has. And I think we sort of touched on some of the different benefits NLP can have, which sort of go hand in hand. But um, What are your thoughts on generative AI, and where do you believe the future lies with this technology?
Yeah, I think, yeah, as you said, I think the field has been preparing it for a long time in general. There are a lot of building pieces going in, but it's good to see like it being applied to products and people using it in generative AI, and I can see immediate benefits coming out of it in general. Like for summarization, I think it's a very perfect tool. Like if you have text, you want to summarize it, write it differently. And someone like for me, like English is not the first language, so I think it helps me to better write documents in general. So I think those are like if you don't want to write everything from that, but let's say if you want to edit, I think those are good solutions in general. And I feel like there are things around speech, as you mentioned, right? Like creating speech in different languages. Earlier, it's difficult to scale. Now, I think the technology is at a point where the quality is good enough in general. You don't need to question the quality a lot. There's still some gaps, but I think the quality is getting to a point that you can, okay, this makes sense. And then I think also I'm seeing like a lot of like I think there's a lot of like focus I think around like NLP, but it's also around vision in general. How do you content like generate visual content? So I think that's like a new thing in general. Like not necessarily limit yourself to one modality, but use NLP vision combination to get to a point where you can use them. So I think it comes with great advancements, and it's like it's backed by research in general, and a lot of research is happening. But I would say it's not only about like advancements in the algorithms, but like a lot of how do you collect the labels, how do you generate that data sets, and then how do you train those models. So like different fields coming together in some sense. And if I look back, like in 2018, people were using LLMs or like kind of style of training only for let's say NLP domains, but now they have been going into vision. Like recommendation system is also using like sequential modeling and things that I was doing with tutoring systems. We didn't have that idea, but now those things like are being applied to different fields. So I can see like different fields coming together in some sense, like applications being built together on all of those. But I think that's like good advancements. But then also I think there are some ethical considerations that people need to have. So I think with this, I feel like probably technology is advancing faster than probably the ethical considerations at this point, but I think that will connect at some point. I think the law would and those ethical and policy makers, I think they would catch hold of it, and I think those things would connect to remove the fear that people might have. But I think this is a fundamental like progress in my opinion, and I think that that's something that brings value, and I think that should keep going. But you need to be just addressing the ethical concerns that are regarding it, and I think that that's going to happen. And also, like some things might change, like the way you work, like with Copilot and like auto coding, like some things might change that might bring fear to people, like is the jobs losing and stuff. But I think it's about like upskilling, keep upskilling yourself. Like the way things are being done might change, but it's not that. Like you can upskill and use like utilize tools to speed up and probably remove like the repetitive tasks and make things stronger in general. But
Yeah.
yeah,
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's very interesting. It went from like a research problem to still a research problem, but also a product problem now. And I think that's what I've seen is that we have the APIs, we have the access to the technology now, but what is the actual products that are going to come out from the technology? That's what's really interesting. And that's why when it comes to like my 2 cents is when it comes to generative AI, I think there's a lot of potential there, and I'm very excited about it. But at the same time, I feel like a lot of the use cases right now are very like they're good, but a lot of them are like still requiring more in-depth conversations in terms of if this will actually, it's actually. Oh, 1 second. Sorry, can you hear me?
yeah,
Okay, I'm just gonna write this down so I can edit it out. Yeah, but going to where I was saying, um, but I think yeah, a lot of the work that's going to have to be done is like, okay, we have technology, but how do we actually make it useful for people? And I think in general, like the second point you mentioned there, I think with the ethical considerations. To be honest, cards on the table. I feel like we've always reacted to technology as
yeah,
it comes and start figuring out how to make laws and the ethical considerations around it. But I think this concern that people have about jobs being replaced is legitimate in terms of
yeah,
we won't need as much manpower, but at the same time, I don't see full replacement
Yeah.
of humans with AI, because I
Yeah.
think even then the the future I see is AI can assist humans to to create new things a lot easier, but complete replacement I think is out of the domain, so, or for now at least. So it'll be interesting to see. It'll be interesting how it evolves, but there's a lot of interesting things coming out, and it's been an interesting hype cycle.
Yeah, and I think also I think the human creativity would evolve in a different direction, and I think that's like combination would make things better in general. And I totally agree that it won't replace things. It just like some things might change, and you need to adjust for those changes in general. Like
Right,
I think
right,
things would be more seamless.
right,
And
makes sense.
and I think one thing I'm seeing, like at least these techniques, right? Like I think they have scope to change like healthcare in a big sense. Like that's what I'm also excited about. Like in drug discoveries, patient care, and like also like something like diagnosis. I think that's where I think you have tons of data, but like how do you make sense of it? So I think those things would see like more direction through these techniques too in general. So like excited about like even if I look back at COVID-19, which was a hard time for everyone, but like the way vaccinations were rolled out, that was pretty good in general, like the timing. And in that perspective, I think more AI driven progress in healthcare would be interesting to see.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. But yeah, no, just it's. I think it's been a great conversation, and to wrap it up, I know one of the things you also do on the side is, you look into seed investments. So it's always interesting to see what different people's investment theses are, the spaces that they're really excited about, and what they're focusing on. So for you, like what is that? Like what are those different fields and that thesis that you have for your seed investments?
Yeah, I think I mostly like I think education is like something that close to me in general. Like I started doing tutoring systems around that time, but I would like to like still keep connected with like using ML in education. So that's where I'm mostly interested in. The other domain is like ad tech and ML platforms because that's where my experience is, and I can see like what's going on and add value. And one way I like investments in like startups, I think it gets me more connected to what's happening more widely in general in the field. Like you get to know, okay, this is like also what's happening, and it gets me connected and pushes me in a way that I can see how the industry is evolving, at being at more closer to the work that's going on in startups. I think that keeps me motivated in some sense. But in terms of like investments, I think the team and execution matters the most. So I think looking at the right team, like team in general, and whether they have executed in the past or they have the enthusiasm or like that execution and background. In some domains you need the background too, but do you have that execution that you can bring it? Because I think ideas are all there in general. Some of the ideas have been tried previously, might not work, but it's not that much about the idea in general, but like the execution and the network that you have to make that happen. I think
Right.
that's like critical for success.
Totally. Okay, makes sense. Well, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast, Ayush. Before I let you go, I have two last questions. The second last one being, is there a book that you recommend us reading or checking out?
I think one book that I really like is like by Scott Adams. Like it's some called like How to Fail at Everything and Still Win Big. Like he's like author of Dilbert Comics. I think that's a book. I think it's about like how you can learn from your failures, and I think he had multiple failures and how you can learn, keep learning, and then you might get success eventually. So I think that's like one thing that I really like, and people might like to read. But yeah,
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I will add that to my reading list. It's ever growing, so I gotta really start on it. But honestly, like I think I gotta start doing audiobooks. I always just end up reading the first half of the book really well, and the second half
yeah,
is just hard to keep continuing. But
yeah.
anyway, that's besides the point. But the last question I have is, what can we look forward to? What's next for you and Pinterest as a whole?
Yeah, I think at Pinterest, I'm still like working on the domain of privacy, trying to push the boundaries of like privacy and recommendation system, hoping to have good balance there in general. So I think that's what, and I think Pinterest ads is still growing. Like I think the good part of Pinterest, I think the teams are still very small in general. So we look forward to increasing the connection between advertisers and Pinners in general. So excited about that.
Okay. Okay, awesome. Well, once again, Ayush, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. And for anybody listening, thank you so much for tuning in. And until the next one, take care and see you later. A lot of people have been asking me what I use to do my podcast, and I'm happy to say that I use Zencastr. Zencastr is awesome because it's an all-in-one platform that allows you to have all the tools that you need from distribution to recording all in one platform. And so whether you want to record on the platform or you want to distribute to Apple Music and Spotify, you can do that all through Zencastr. It's also really easy to record a podcast with Zencastr because it's available on the browser. And the best thing about it is you actually get studio audio quality from those recordings because Zencastr records the audio into the browser and then uploads it to the cloud. So you don't have to necessarily worry about your mic not being as good as you see in some video calls online. So if you want to get started with Zencastr today, feel free to go to zencastr.com/pricing and use my offer code DavidG for 30% off your first paid month. I'm really excited to see all the stories you guys share using Zencastr.